Thanks for joining this presentation on the smartphone usage divide, differences in people's smartphone behavior, and implications for mobile data collection. My name is Alexander Wenz. I'm a postdoc in the School of Social Sciences at the University of Mannheim, and this is joint work with Florian Keusch, also from the University of Mannheim. Smartphones are increasingly used for data collection in the social sciences. On the one hand, they can be used to administer survey questionnaires, either through the web browser or through survey apps. For example, to implement diary studies or in the moment surveys that measure people's behaviors or feelings throughout the day. On smartphones, survey participants can also respond to questions verbally or by taking photos with a smartphone camera. For example, in the context of an expenditure study, we asked participants to take a photo of all their shopping receipts instead of recording their expenses in a diary. On the other hand, smartphones allow to collect data passively from the inbuilt sensors. For example, we can use GPS to measure people's mobility and travel patterns. We can rely on the accelerometer to measure people's physical activity. And we can use log files from the operating system to measure things such as app usage or calling and texting behavior. Another technology that's useful for research is Bluetooth, because it allows to link smartphones to other measurement devices, such as fitness trackers or smart scales. The advantage of these passive data collection methods is that we can capture behaviors unobtrusively and with high levels of accuracy and granularity, and thereby reducing recall errors. Now, while smartphones have such a great potential for data collection in the social sciences, there are still quite a few challenges that we are facing, and one of them is limited smartphone coverage. When we look at recent numbers from Eurostat, the good news is that the large majority of people aged 16 and older in Germany, around 75%, used a smartphone in 2019. And this number went up by 60 percentage points compared to a decade ago. However, there are still 25% who don't use a smartphone. And there's evidence that smartphone ownership still varies by age, gender, and education, among other factors. These patterns are quite similar in other Western countries. Beyond smartphone access, there are also differences in the extent that people are able to use smartphones that researchers have to take into account. In the context of general internet usage, Esther Hagetay already argued back in 2002 that the digital access divide shifts towards what she called a second level digital divide, which is centered around differences in digital skills and usage patterns. And we think the same applies to the smartphone context. While ownership rates have increased, we need to consider that individuals still have differential ability to participate in smartphone-based data collection. For example, while installing a research app on one's phone might be an easy task for some respondents, others might have greater difficulties doing so. Now, existing research on coverage error and smartphone studies still focuses on the distinction between owners and non-owners. And with this paper, we want to shed more light on the usage patterns of smartphone owners. In today's presentation, I want to focus on three research questions. First, which smartphone usage types can be identified among smartphone owners? Second, what are the characteristics of these smartphone usage types? And here we want to look at sociodemographics, but also at willingness to participate in research and privacy concerns. And third, how stable are these smartphone usage types across time and samples? We use data from 5 samples of smartphone owners collected between 2016 and 2020 in Germany and Austria. These data come from both probability and non-probability online surveys, and the same questions were asked in all 5 surveys. In this presentation, I mainly focus on the most recent survey, sample 5, with data collected from a non-probability online panel in 2020. Quotas were used for age and gender to get a sample of sufficient diversity. So half of the sample is male, half is female, and around 25% are in each of these 4 age groups. Regarding education, we have 45% without high school degree, 26% with a high school degree, and 29% with a college degree. And this maps the education distribution in Germany quite well. To identify different types of smartphone users, we employ a latent class analysis to cluster individuals based on their similarity in smartphone usage patterns. And we use the Polka package in R to do the analysis. Our LCA is based on 3 indicators. That's frequency of smartphone use, self-rated smartphone skills, and smartphone activities. And let me briefly show you each of these indicators. To measure frequency of smartphone use, we asked, how often do you use a smartphone for activities other than phone calls or text messaging, with response options ranging from several times a day to once a month or less. To measure smartphone skills, we asked, generally, how would you rate your skills of using your smartphone? And we used a numeric scale ranging from 1 beginner to 5 advanced. And finally, we asked whether respondents used their smartphone for any of these activities, including browsing websites, reading and or writing emails, taking photos, using social media, making purchases, doing online banking, installing new apps, using GPS, using Bluetooth, playing games, and streaming videos or music. Among these activities, we can distinguish between 3 categories in terms of the relevance for mobile data collection. First, browsing websites and reading emails on the smartphone are relevant skills for completing a browser-based web survey on a smartphone. Second, taking photos, installing new apps, and using Bluetooth and GPS are all relevant skills for engaging in app and sensor-based data collection. And the other activities, such as making purchases, or doing online banking, are not directly relevant for data collection, but they contribute to the general skill set of smartphone users. Okay, let's turn to our first research question. Which smartphone usage types can be identified among smartphone owners? As I mentioned, I will show the results from sample 5, but the patterns are very similar in the other 4 samples. The latent class analysis allows us to identify 6 distinct smartphone usage types, which we call as follows. The advanced users. This is the largest usage group that constitutes almost half of the sample. Broad non-commercial users. This is the second largest group that makes up around 1/4 of the sample. And 4 smaller groups. These are broad non-social media users, basic general users, social media and information users, and camera users. Now, how do these usage types look like? In this table, you can see the indicators we used in the latent class analysis by smartphone usage type. The first 3 usage types reflect more frequent and diverse smartphone use. Users in these groups use their smartphones several times a day and mostly rate their skills as advanced or intermediate. The only difference is in the range of activities carried out in their smartphone. While advanced users are engaged in all 12 activities that we asked about, the distinctive feature of broad non-commercial users is that they use their smartphone for almost all activities except for those commercially related, that is making online purchases and using online banking. And similarly, broad non-social media users are engaged in almost all activities except for viewing and posting content on social media. Now, the other 3 usage types reflect more narrow and less frequent smartphone use. Among basic general users, there is an equal proportion of people who use a smartphone every day and of those who use a smartphone several times a week or less. But overall, they mostly rate their smartphone skills as beginner. They mostly use their smartphone to browse websites and read or write emails. And other popular activities include installing new apps, taking photos, and using GPS-based apps. Although these basic general users are engaged in relatively few activities overall, they are still engaged in the key activities that would be relevant for completing a mobile web survey, that is browsing websites and reading or writing emails, and for participating in app and sensor data collection, such as installing new apps or using GPS. Then there are the social media and information users who use their smartphone quite frequently, that is several times a day, but mostly rate their smartphone skills as beginner and are only engaged in few activities, mainly to browse websites and use social media. Finally, camera users only use their smartphone several times a week or less, and mainly to take photos. When we as researchers invite people to participate in mobile data collection, these last 2 groups, the social media and information users and the camera users, might be those that we should pay more attention to. Okay, what are the characteristics of these smartphone usage types? Let's first look at the sociodemographic composition. We find significant age, gender, and education differences across the 6 groups. Among the 3 usage types that reflect more frequent and diverse use, as well as among social media and information users, the majority are below the age of 40. Camera users and basic general users, however, constitute the oldest age groups, with a majority aged 50 and older. We find that most usage types are balanced regarding gender. The only exception are broad-known social media users and basic general users who have a larger proportion of men. The smartphone usage types also differ by education, with, for example, advanced users having a higher level of educational attainment than camera users. Next, let's have a look at how these user groups differ in terms of willingness to participate in app-based research and privacy concerns. So first, we asked respondents whether they would be willing to install a research app on their phone, which passively collects data from a range of sensors, such as the smartphone's location and movement, and data from the operating system log files. We find that people with more frequent and diverse usage patterns are much more willing to install such an app, with, for example, 59% of advanced users indicating their willingness, compared to those with less frequent and less diverse patterns. For example, only 19% of camera users said they were willing to install such an app. And we see similar patterns for privacy concerns that people have towards research activities on a smartphone, although the magnitude of the difference really depends on the type of activity. For installing an app that tracks people's GPS location, advanced users, for example, are less likely to indicate concerns compared to the other usage types. But the levels of privacy concerns are relatively high across all user groups. For other activities, such as installing a survey app, the differences in privacy concerns are more pronounced. For example, less than half of advanced users report privacy concerns, compared to more than 2/3 of camera users reporting concerns. Finally, how stable are these smartphone usage types across time and samples? We conducted latent class analysis for each of the other samples collected in 2016, 2017, and 2018, but we did not find major differences compared to the LCA on the 2020 sample that I just showed you. We identified similar usage types with similar characteristics. And this finding might be explained by the relatively short time period that we covered, with the usage patterns remaining relatively stable across these 4 years. The aim of this presentation was to characterize smartphone owners based on their skills and usage patterns. Although smartphones are increasingly integrated into people's daily life, usage patterns continue to be highly diverse. And in this study, we were able to identify 6 distinct smartphone usage types. These findings have implications for mobile data collection. If we as researchers invite study participants to engage in app and sensor data collection, we need to be mindful of people who might be less experienced with tasks relevant for data collection, such as installing new apps or using GPS. To include them in our data collection efforts, we might need to provide them with additional assistance, for example, by helping them to install the required apps on their phone when we invite them to the study. And we need to address the privacy concerns that they have, for instance, by providing clear explanations of the protocol and the types of data that will be collected as part of the study. Overall, we would welcome future research on coverage error that also takes these differences in skills and usage patterns into account. Thanks for joining this presentation. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to get in touch via email. Thanks.